All right, guys, here's the next section for your star review. This is another real condensed, I guess, version of one of our sections called Imperialism. Uh, if you remember, the idea of imperialism really is this sense that when a strong country attempts to try to gain some control, either politically, economically, over a smaller, weaker nation, and there's multiple different ways that you can go about doing this. Now, the reason why the United States is going to do this is no different than other European countries or any other countries throughout history, pretty much. There's some pretty much economic motivations as well as military strategy motivations, but this is just America's time to become imperialistic. To give you an idea, so let's start with the United States. And when it comes to the United States, the idea of America beginning to grow outside of the United States, outside of our boundaries, really sort of just piggybacks on this idea of manifest destiny. And of course, if you remember manifest destiny, the idea of the United States was destined by God to be occupied from East Coast all the way to the West Coast, and maybe expand just a little bit outside of its borders because God had wanted it that way. He had given this land to spread white Anglo-Saxon culture, technology, forms of government, religion, etc. This was sort of a gift by God to white settlers coming into the United States for them to begin migrating and pushing their ways forward. Now, of course, in the United States, after we built the Transcontinental Railroad and we began occupying from coast to coast, the Native Americans are now located on their reservation because of the Dawes Act. Well, we start looking outside of our borders and think, holy crud, I mean, why stop here? So this is going to be the idea under imperialism, American imperialism. It's our time to begin in spreading our influence outside of the United States in an attempt to either spread American culture, American values, religion, Anglo-Saxonism, in an attempt to influence other parts of the world. Now, the main reasons for American imperialism are going to be varied. Probably one of the most valuable, or actually probably the highest motivators for American imperialism is going to be this idea to try to provide the country with more natural resources. Again, we were really cranking down in our Industrial Revolution. We were in desperate need for these natural resources located in other parts of the world to continue to pump and fuel and energize the United States Industrial Revolution and our manufacturing. Because remember, we were becoming pretty much the leading manufacturers for products to be purchased outside of the United States. Another main reason for imperialism, of course, is to provide us with some trade partners. I mean, we are now one of the leading producers of goods in the world. Why not? We got to start finding some customers. I mean, think about it, at this time, pretty much the United States is the China of today. We were the leading producers. China becomes one of the leading consumers. So we're going to need to find other people than just other Americans to sell our products to. So we start looking outside of the United States to begin trying to solidify new customers. A third and other reason for imperialism is to give us some overseas military bases. And the idea is, if we're going to try to protect our trade ships, if we're going to really influence or encourage people to begin purchasing American products and goods, we're going to need to have militaries located in different parts of the world to protect those trade vessels, to protect those trade routes, to help subtly influence other countries to deal with us in trade negotiations. And of course, fourth, the idea that we thought within the United States it was our duty to spread this Anglo-Saxonism to the dark corners of the world. And for those of you who aren't familiar really with what Anglo-Saxonism is, it's this idea that, Anglo-Saxons had superior forms of government, superior forms of science, religion, are just general ethics and values. And we thought it was our duty to share those or encourage others to begin adopting those same ways because we figured it worked so well for us. Why not try to spread it to other corners of the world? Now, how do we begin going about doing this? Well, one of the ways is when we had Commodore Matthew Perry is encouraged to sail over to Japan. And when he does sail over to Japan, he will show the Japanese government there, the imperial system, etc., the advantages of the American industrial centers. the type of industries that we were creating, the type of products and goods, military equipment we were able to provide to other parts of the world, and we encouraged the Japanese to begin trade negotiations with us, and in time we will begin to help them to develop their own industrial centers, which they rapidly will begin building up to become one of the dominant industrial powers in the early to mid part of the 20th century. Now, later on, another opportunity for the United States to begin gaining actual physical territory and incorporating it into the United States, of course, is going to be the acquisition of Alaska from Russia. Historically, this is sort of mimically known as Seward's Folly. When our Secretary of State, William Seward, will begin negotiations to purchase Alaska from Russia. Everybody makes fun of it, thought it was one of the dumbest things that America could ever do. We were purchasing this large swath of land that even the Russians didn't want, and everybody made fun of it. Well, obviously, that's going to wind up becoming to his benefit, because we are going to wind up discovering the Klondike Gold Rush, making it incredibly profitable for the United States. Another opportunity for the United States to begin expanding and using its imperialist powers or imperialist mind is going to be looking just outward offside the coast of the United States in the Pacific, in the area of Hawaii. Well, once we begin doing a significant amount of trade with Japan and with China, after we negotiate the open door policy, which happens a little bit later on, we begin having a lot of interest in Hawaii, because we begin to think, you know what, there's a couple of things major that happen there. I mean, it'd be a very good place for a military base to protect our trade routes as we have access into the Pacific area over in here. As well as, we also know this is a very profitable place for growing produce. Sanford Dole, if you remember, will help organize a revolution there in Hawaii, eventually overthrowing the Queen Liliuokalani. Immediately setting up an independent republic of Hawaii, soon to be annexed or made into an incorporated territory of the United States. This is one of the very first little more physical aggressions that we will take part in to encourage a province there to become part of the United States. Of course, the native Hawaiians were not happy with this at all. They're going to protest, they're going to criticize, but the military might, as well as the financial impact and the financial power that the United States will have at this time, is too much for the Hawaiians to be able to resist it all. And this question has been asked a couple of different ways. If you remember, this happens in 1898. In a past STAR exam, one of these questions has gone like this: to His Excellency William McKinley, President and the Senate of the United States of America, we, the undersigned native Hawaiian citizens who are members of the Hawaiian Patriotic League of the Hawaiian Islands, and others who are in sympathy with the said league, earnestly protest against the addition of the said Hawaiian Islands to the said United States of America in any form or shape. Well, what were these Hawaiian citizens protesting? The questions are like, well, okay, it's the forced annexation of the islands as U.S. territory after the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. This is what we just talked about. We're talking about the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. They are forced into becoming annexed as an American territory. And this is a protest, obviously, type question. STAR's real big on how well you're able to read quotes, legalese. Again, anytime that you see some of these questions, pay very particular attention to the date. We've talked about some of the key dates in American history, especially some of the first ones they really tend to focus on are around 1898, that time of the Spanish-American War, as well as the annexation of Hawaii as being sort of their imperialist, heavy-centered questions. Now, after Hawaii, to go along with some motivations for building military bases as a motive for imperialism, there's an individual named Alfred T. Mahan, who winds up writing a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And he basically advocates that, look, it's really incumbent upon the powers of the United States and the politicians of the United States to build a very strong navy. If you look at the history of the world, especially within the 18th and 19th centuries, and even part of some of the 17th centuries, it's those countries who have had the biggest and strongest navies were the dominant powers of the world. And he thought this was the formula that America should follow. Build this mighty strong navy, and you will have the opportunity to become one of those historically important world powers. And with that book, it will become a heavily read book throughout much of Congress, as well as most of the military leaders of the United States during the time period. And it will encourage our government to begin building this mighty navy to protect our trade vessels, to use as sort of an intimidation tactic, as well as to protect whatever territories we actually already were in possession of. Alfred T. Mahan has been asked in a number of different ways. Here's one way that he's been asked before. It says in 1890, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, a lecturer in naval history and the president of the United States Naval War College, published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. A revolutionary analysis of the importance of naval power as a factor in the rise of the British Empire. 2 years later, he completed a supplementary volume, The Influence of Sea Power Upon the French Revolution and the Empire. Well, when you see that, we've talked about this before, anytime you see Alfred T. Mahan, you know he's talking about the Navy. You know we're talking about expansion overseas and imperialism. So if you look at the question, Mahan's book influenced U.S. efforts to become a world power primarily by, well, if you're going to try to expand overseas, you're going to need that Navy. So we are talking about F, advocating overseas expansion, and doing so with a mighty Navy. All right, so now not everybody in the United States, of course, was on the imperialist bandwagon. You have some very influential people at this time period who were not fond of the United States becoming imperialistic. Individuals like Mark Twain, the guy who founded the term and coined the term the Gilded Age, if you remember. Also people like our very famous William Jennings Bryan, the guy who runs for president a number of times. He's the very influential prosecutor in the Scopes Monkey trial, which talked about in the Roaring 1920s. He's also the Democratic progressive populist candidate running against William McKinley, who advocates the usage of silver, bimetallism if necessary, in an effort to try to help the farmers. And of course, finally, even Mr. Andrew Carnegie, the guy who writes the Gospel of Wealth, the big major philanthropist within the United States. Each one of these guys really opposed to the idea of imperialism, thinking that it was just the opposite of the idea, the heart and soul of America being a country that was supposed to be for and fostering independence and liberty. And now we're going to use intimidation tactics and imperialism to subjugate other peoples, control other peoples, not let them determine their own futures. They thought it was basically antithetical to everything that the United States had really stood for. Now, probably the most influential thing that's going to happen when it comes to the idea of imperialism that's going to be possibly tested on Star is going to be that Spanish-American War. That Spanish-American War, how they're going to ask this, it can be varied. It can be talking about the causes, it's going to be talking about the effects. Maybe they might look at the influence of geography as to why we decided to get involved into this. But let's look at some of the basics about it. If you remember that the Spanish had been in control of Cuba. Now, there had been rumors going around for a long time that the Spanish had been horrifically abusing a number of the anti-Spanish Cubans there within Cuba. And since the United States and Cuba had become very closely tied economically, especially within agriculture and as some of the railroad production there, the United States seems to begin to develop somewhat of a close kinship with the Cuban people, at least the American citizens were. Maybe not so much of our business leaders, maybe not so much for our politicians, but it's going to be something that some journalists within the United States are going to help to play on the American psyche to get Americans to support this war. Now, if you remember, there were a number of Spanish atrocities that would happen during just prior to the Spanish-American War, where they would be abusing the Cubans, putting them in the concentration camps if necessary, even some instances of overblown news stories of them molesting American women as their ships were being boarded anytime they were close to the shores of Cuba. This one particular Spanish general named Valeriano Weyler was portrayed as somewhat of a butcher in the United States for his treatment of the poor Cubans. And as this gets into the news more and more, the American people start paying attention a little bit more and more. Man, this is happening just right off our borders. It's not very far, and we have this foreign power abusing its indigenous people there, abusing the poor Cubans. That's just really not cool. Maybe we should think about doing something about this at some point. Well, there would be a Cuban poet who will wind up fleeing out of Cuba, making his way into the United States, and his name will be Jose Marti. And Jose Marti is going to lead a lot of these Cuban exiles out of Cuba into the United States and talk about how horrible the Spanish treatment were of the Cubans, and will begin begging for American intervention there to try and get us involved. And of course, one of the things he's going to start talking about is, you Americans, you should really understand our plight. You had a colonial power, a European power who was dominating you just prior to your American Revolution, and you cast off them in a violent revolution in the name of liberty and freedom. We want the same thing here in Cuba. We've got the Spanish in control of us. They're abusing. We should be able to look to you as sort of our big mentor, a fellow sympathizer. Would you please help us out? Well, there'll be two journalists within New York that will really help to flame the embers of American, involvement here. And of course, there's going to be the very two famous publishers, William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal, and then of course Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. Both of these guys are going to be heavily competitive with one another. Each one's always trying to outsell the other one and selling more newspapers than the other guy. And the best way to do it is basically, well, let's make my stories a little more dramatic. Let me make them a little bit more eye-catching. Let me try to write news stories that are much more of an exaggeration of the brutality of what is actually happening there in Cuba. And maybe that'll get more Americans involved in wanting to not only read our newspapers, but maybe foster or help support a potential support for a revolution there in Cuba. Now, these exaggerated news stories that they're going to wind up creating, of course, are known as this yellow journalism, purely designed to just sell newspaper copies, pretty much, but also to kind of inflame the anger of the Americans who should really try to be supporting the poor Cubans being abused by the Spanish. Now, these are just some examples of some things that would be printed in these newspapers. Even Pulitzer himself would basically send a couple of very prominent cartoonists and photographers down there and basically tell them, hey, you provide me with the pictures and I'll provide you with a war. Now, if you see here, you can see some of these pictures about the over-exaggerated and sometimes not so exaggerated abuse of the Cubans by the Spanish. Spaniards search women on American steamers. How dare they, etc., etc. And of course, as Americans began to see this, they become much more upset, making them much more liable to want to support or lend us some support to the Cubans in a potential revolution. We would also have the Delome letter. And of course, remember the Delome letter is going to be this letter sent from the Spanish ambassador back to the government, criticizing President McKinley as being a buffoon. And of course, that aggravates Americans as well. McKinley might have been a turd, but at least he's our turd. Don't bash him. But ultimately, I guess, if there's going to be the one thing that really gets Americans to want to declare war, it's going to be the explosion of the USS Maine, which we had parked down there in Havana Harbor. Of course, nobody's 120% sure that the Spanish were behind this. It very well may be just a pure accident which caused the Maine to explode and sink, killing a number of American sailors. But the Spanish will get blamed for this. And of course, after that, everybody screams, remember the Maine. It's now time for the United States to declare war against the Spanish. Now, the war itself is going to go relatively quickly. It's going to take place in different parts of the world. And if you notice, part of it's going to take place over here where you thought it should be, because it's over here where Cuba is, which is just south of Florida, right over here in the Caribbean. But then it's also going to take place over here in the Pacific, in the area of the Philippines and Guam. Why? Well, that was what Spanish controlled also. This was an all-out war against Spain. We declared war against Spain. Yes, the idea was we were just trying to help liberate the Cubans. But no, since the Maine was sunk, we were going to have an all-out war. That means all of the Spanish territories are now up for grabs. And so as we declare war, we begin attacking different territories possessed by the Spanish. And of course, one of the on Star, sometimes what they will do is provide you with a map and maybe the date, and maybe ask, okay, what sort of led to involvement in this part of the world or this part of the world at this time. Be very familiar with geography. Remember, over here in the Caribbean, some of the first areas we become imperialistic, but then we will also take the opportunity and go out there at the same time and go after the Spanish there in the Philippines, because we figured, shoot, we might as well try to go ahead and gain that territory to get access, because if we can get control of this territory here, we can really influence trade and other things that happen here in Asia. All right. Now, as far as a couple of individuals that you might want to be familiar with, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, will wind up becoming an enormous hero at this time. He will become leader of the Rough Riders, this all-cowboy cavalry, and of course, most famously is his success there at San Juan Hill. He had been the Secretary of the Navy, and of course, his success and popularity there will lead William McKinley to eventually nominate him to become his vice presidential candidate, because he was very popular with the Western states, not to mention that, of course, McKinley's vice president had died. Now, if you need to remember that maybe Teddy Roosevelt, of course, gains fame as his success as a Rough Rider, and his really aggressive mentality there, and his popularity again with the Western states. Maybe that's a way they might want to look at the question. By the time that the Spanish-American War is over, because it does end relatively quickly, the Spanish did not want this war at all. They were a fading world power. They were no way prepared to handle the United States industry, their eagerness to acquire this new territory. And so the war is going to end relatively quickly with a brutal Spanish loss. And of course, after this war, the United States will gain territory in multiple parts of the world, both the eastern and western hemispheres. And now the United States will get control of Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. They will gain influence over Cuba. It's always important to remember, we do not get Cuba. It does not become an American territory. We will have a tremendous amount of influence of what happens there, as well as get control of Guantanamo Bay, but we do not get total control of it. But we do get control of the Philippines, especially after a short Revolutionary War, because it's not like the Filipinos were happy about the United States now being in charge of them instead of the Spanish. Now we're going to have a very short revolution or a war there against Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the Filipino rebel leader. But eventually, after that war ends and the Filipinos surrender to the United States, we'll have control of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and now we have territories in both hemispheres, making the United States an official world imperialistic power. And that's probably one of the more, the biggest point that they really want to try to impress upon students when it comes to STAR, is that this war makes the United States an imperialist power. We now have territory and control over countries in other parts of the world, outside of our own borders, and we influence things that happen in another part of the world. Now, the war is going to actually wind up being so successful. John Hay, our United States Secretary of State, is going to wind up calling this a splendid little war. And the reason why is because it happened very quickly. We got a tremendous amount of territory. We demonstrated our ability to hang and wage a war totally on our own and defeat another European power. Now, we are going to be recognized throughout the world as a legitimate world power from this point on. A lot of parts of the world begin looking at the United States as, this may be a rising new big boy on the block. And now we're going to start having a lot more influence in a part of the world we really wanted to get into, which was going to be Asia. Now, after the Spanish-American War, we will have to now figure out, yay, of course, the Cubans are now free, but now what do we do with them? I mean, do we make them a state? No, we're not going to have that happen, because that would just defeat the entire purpose of the reason why we got involved, which is to try to somewhat liberate them. But we still wanted to have a good bit of impact of what happened there, and we wanted to figure out a way to profit off of the ability to get control over or influence heavily what happened there in Cuba. So the idea is we're going to pass what is known as the Platt Amendment, and this deals specifically with Cuba. And the Platt Amendment will officially make Cuba a protectorate of the United States. Yes, it is its own independent nation, but we will influence heavily what happens there within their politics. We will have a military base down there. We will have the right to intervene anytime that we feel that it goes against American interests, any deals that they make there. We will definitely support political candidates. They will be free, but heavily cloaked under our influence. All right. Now, not long after the Spanish-American War, McKinley is going to wind up being assassinated. And of course, if you remember, right before he gets assassinated, he tapped Teddy Roosevelt to become his vice president. Now, a lot of Republicans were not thrilled about this because they thought he was way too, I guess, too aggressive. He wasn't playing the typical Republican-type politics at the time. He was somewhat of a populist. He was very popular in the western states, like I said, in the Dakotas, etc. But that's one of the reasons why McKinley wanted him, because he was very popular in states that he was not able to win before when he ran against William Jennings Bryan. McKinley gets assassinated. Next thing you know, Teddy Roosevelt does become President of the United States and the youngest president in American history at the age of 43 years old. Now, one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt winds up bringing in as far as foreign policy, everybody knows, and we've talked about this over and over, is his big stick diplomacy, which is very simple. It's just the idea that if any nations in our part of the world, especially around the area that we have control of, the Philippines, there within Hawaii, especially within the Caribbean, the idea was if we build up a very strong Navy and parade our Navy around and use it as a potential threat, that nations are going to be very reluctant to ever want to go to war with us or challenge any of our policies that we tend to try to exert through other parts of the world. You speak softly but carry a very big stick. We're not going to try to provoke a war, but by gosh, we are going to wind up having a very big military to use if we need it, which goes a long way in opening up negotiations as well as getting a lot of American policy adopted in other parts of the world. Now, this is all going to wind up morphing into later on as what's going to be called his Roosevelt Corollary. Now, let's look at one of these questions that we've seen before on STAR when it comes to Teddy Roosevelt. Now, again, let's remember, when we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt, don't be afraid to use your military. If Europeans try to influence our part of the world at all, if they want to have any influence or try to check our power and authority around any territories that we are in control of, or especially right off out our back door, then yeah, we're going to butt in. So let's look at some of these questions. One of the questions like this: chronic wrongdoing, which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing, to exercise of an international police power. President Roosevelt issues the statement in response to do what? A, the construction of a Panama Canal. B, the threat of European intervention in Latin America. C, the Spanish efforts to suppress a rebellion in Cuba. Or D, the public outcry regarding war between Russia and Japan. Well, the answer here is going to be B, the threat of European intervention in Latin America. Once again, Roosevelt, if you remember, is going to adopt what is known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And that Roosevelt Corollary is basically going to be the idea that other parts of the world need to completely butt out of our half of the world. I mean, the entire Caribbean, South America, Central America, whatever, that's all under our influence now. If any of you guys try to butt into this half of the world, we will exert our right and our authority to butt in any time that we see it, using our military if necessary. That was the extension of that Monroe Doctrine. If you remember, in 1823, you had President Monroe basically said the United States of America is off limits to all colonization to European powers. Roosevelt expands on it. He says, well, not just that, out of this entire half of the world, North America, South America, Central America, that's off limits to European involvement or European influence this half of the world, and we'll butt in anytime that we feel like it, using our military to keep this from happening. Now, let's start expanding a little bit further. If you remember, China had become pretty much one of the world's leading not only purchasers of goods, but also provided a lot of goods that other parts of the world wanted as well. And China had been for years divided up into sort of controlled provinces or controlled sectors by European countries as well as Russia and some others, because everybody wanted to make a dollar there in China. Well, the United States for a long time was not involved anywhere close to being having access into those Chinese markets. So the United States, in an attempt to gain access into those markets to make more money, is going to call for the open door policy with China, which is basically that, we want not just the United States involved in being able to purchase and sell there in China, but we want all countries to be able to have access there to be able to sell and trade openly and freely with. As a matter of fact, if we do not have an open door policy, we're afraid a world war might potentially break out. So the United States attempts to try to be the big boy. Really, the whole purpose is for us to be able to again begin dominating some economic markets there. But it's the idea that we want everybody to have equal access into Chinese markets to buy, sell, and trade with freely and openly without any sort of threat of war. By claiming you can only this one country has control of being able to buy and sell and trade in this one small part of China. We're not going to divide China up like you see in this cartoon here. All these European countries are wanting to divide and carve China up for themselves. The United States says, no, let's make it open for everybody. Just another way for the United States to be a little bit imperialistic during this time period. Now, backing up that big stick diplomacy that Roosevelt used to love to do, in 1908, Roosevelt is going to send out a newly commissioned fleet known as the Great White Fleet, which would be a number of state-of-the-art battleships at the time. And he's going to send them around the world for everybody to see. Painted great white. Now, was there, some sort of Anglo-Saxon symbolism involved in this? Maybe, possibly. Or was it just because it was designed as something antagonistic? Possibly, yet peaceful, possibly. But a lot of people understood that the Great White Fleet was designed as an intimidation tactic, an intimidation tool. We were going to send these ships to parts of the world who very well may be reluctant to want to embrace American policy and embrace American trade markets. And maybe we could use these battleships as, hey, here's our big stick, don't make us use it, sort of thing. Now, later on, as Roosevelt becomes president of the United States, and knowing the experience of the Spanish-American War, there was an opportunity to take advantage of an opportunity there in the little Isthmus of Panama in Central America, in which Colombia had been in control of the little area of Panama there, and the Panamanians had, talked about wanting their revolution and wanting to have their own independence. We're not willing to do so, but with the help of the United States, we convince, wink, wink, the Colombians to go ahead and give the Panamanians their independence. Well, in efforts and payback for doing so, we're going to help negotiate what's called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which is going to give the United States the exclusive right to build a canal through Central America, which, yes, this is the Panama Canal. Now, other countries had tried to as well. It's just a very daunting task. You really need the industry, you need the commitment, you need the wealth, the time, and the resources to be able to do it. And really, at this time, the United States was the only one that would have the ability to do so. Everybody saw the advantage of being able to do this. Starr was really big on what is the advantage of this Panama Canal under the direction of Teddy Roosevelt. And basically, the Panama Canal, as you can see, is going to wind up going through some of the thinnest parts there of Panama, goes through a lot of swamps. It's going to go through a lot of lowlands. But ultimately, what is significant about it is going to be the first time you're going to be able to see the joining of the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean artificially. And this is enormous. It's an enormous undertaking. But it was necessary because in the Spanish-American War we saw it was a booger to try to get military from one hemisphere of the world to the other hemisphere of the world, from the Pacific to the Atlantic. It took a tremendous amount of time because you had to go through the southern tip of South America, and that was a very dangerous, long, and arduous trip. And we figured, you know what, if we can just build this little shortcut toll road right through here, not only are we going to save a bunch in getting our military from point A to point B, but my gosh, what is it going to be able to do for us financially? We can shorten up our trade time, shorten up our manufacturing time, or at least processes manufacturing goods from the East Coast over to the West Coast, or one part of the world to the other, saving millions and millions and millions of dollars in the long run. This was going to be and plus, who's going to be in charge of it? Well, the United States. I mean, we're going to be the ones that decides who does and does not get to go through this thing, which was going to be another lucrative endeavor for the United States. So STAR is going to be really big on wanting to understand, can you understand the geographical impact of the Panama Canal? Maybe they'll ask it to you as a quote, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised, maybe a map, maybe, because they really want you to see if you understand that it really was an advantage for trade and military purposes to build this shortcut from the Atlantic over into the Pacific. So here's an example of one of those type of questions. Differences in maritime shipping distances before and after the Panama Canal opened. You're talking about, shipping times at one point versus shipping times at another point, looking at the difference in nautical miles prior to the construction of the Panama Canal. Then with the construction of the Panama Canal, you can see how much time gets shortened up. So what was the main effect of the changes shown in this graph between the Western United States? Is it F, immigration from Europe to Western Europe cities increased rapidly? And, I don't think so. Western U.S. businesses traded more efficiently with the East Coast and Europe? Well, it may be. Let's look at the next one. Asian businesses bypassed the West Coast to trade directly with the East Coast, or J, Western states recruited guest workers from the Caribbean and South America. That's not really what it's looking at here. It's looking at distance. It's looking at shipping distances. Now we can ship things from point A to point B a lot faster because you're going a shorter distance, which means you can now trade more efficiently with the East Coast and Europe. Western businesses can. That's kind of how they like to ask the question. All right, well, one of the things we discovered during the construction of the Panama Canal was the impact of not that we didn't already know, but the tremendous impact of diseases. Of course, it's in a really marshy area, it's a very swampy area, it's very hot, and of course, malaria and yellow fever would be brutal on the construction workers down there in Central America building the Panama Canal. And, of course, out of necessity sometimes comes invention. Yes, we will lose thousands of people to yellow fever, but because of this, we will also end up coming up with the cure for malaria, which would be quinine, because of the Panama Canal. Because of the number of deaths that took place there, something had to be done. So we'll have the development of a cure for and treatment for those diseases. Possibly another way that STAR might ask you, or something they might ask you on the construction of the Panama Canal. Now, to kind of help wrap up a little bit on this imperialism thing, after Roosevelt decides he's not going to run again, he advocates, of course, William Howard Taft to become the next president of the United States, which he does. Now, Taft will wind up adopting a lot of his populist, sort of quasi-progressive policies there. But instead of using the same big stick diplomacy that Roosevelt had really pushed for to have America really influence our half of the world in Central and South America, Taft says, you know what, let's not use this big stick and threat of force and military force to have good relations with Mexico, South America, Central America. Let's use good trade policies. Let's use our checkbook. Maybe it's better to get good, loyal relationship with those countries in this part of the world through peaceful economic conditions instead of the threat of force. And that'll be known as Taft's dollar diplomacy. Now, how thrilled was Roosevelt with that afterwards? He was kind of like, not so much, not too thrilled on it, but he didn't speak out too much against it. He'll really hit Taft a little bit really harder later on when it comes to his environmental policies and some other things, eventually leading to Roosevelt to try to challenge him by setting up his Progressive Bull Moose Party in the next election, eventually leading up to the election of Woodrow Wilson. All right, so guys, that ends sort of a brief look at the imperialist era. Make sure that you do review over your notes. There is a copious amount of them, obviously. Look over the previous quizzes, star exams, other things that I provided for you and shared with you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, or you can email me at brian.pierce, brian.pierce, Pierce, at scurry, SCURRY, Rosser, ROSSER.com. Thanks a lot. See yas.